Hello and welcome to the Unseen Question.
Here's something we don't say often enough: human rights aren't just political ideals. They're personal. They shape how we live, how we treat others, and how we understand ourselves. They protect the things most of us take for granted: the ability to speak our minds, to question ideas, to love openly, to raise our kids without fear, and to walk away from belief systems that no longer make sense to us. Holy books, for many people, offer meaning. They offer identity, community, and comfort. And that's not something to mock, but comfort can't be the measure of truth. And identity can't be a shield from criticism. Especially when it comes at someone else's expense. No idea is beyond examination. Not even the ones written in gold. The more we treat ancient texts as untouchable, the more we freeze morality in place. We lock ourselves into systems designed for people who lived thousands of years ago, under circumstances we can barely imagine, and we end up defending rules not because they work, but because they're old. That's not wisdom. That's inertia. We need something better than inherited obedience. We need frameworks that are built around human needs, not divine commands. Frameworks that adapt when they fall short, that protect the weak from the strong, that care more about preventing suffering than about preserving tradition, and we have those frameworks. We built them. Slowly, imperfectly, but deliberately. It's not about replacing religion with some cold legalism. It's about putting people first. It's about asking hard questions, even when the answers make us uncomfortable, like, what happens when tradition and justice don't line up? What do we do when sacred texts tell us to look away from cruelty, or worse, to participate in it? What do we owe to others, not as members of the same faith, or the same tribe, but just as fellow humans, equally capable of joy, pain, fear, and hope? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're being answered every day, in courtrooms, classrooms, homes, and parliaments. The answers shape real lives, and whether we admit it or not, those answers come down to a simple choice. Do we build our world around unchangeable authority, or around shared humanity? That choice plays out in how we treat women seeking freedom, queer people asking to exist without shame, apostates risking everything to be honest, and children born into systems that were never built with their dignity in mind. Human rights say, you matter. Full stop. No divine stamp needed. No conditions. No exceptions. That idea is still controversial in many places. But it's worth defending, because rights that can be taken away by faith were never rights to begin with, and morality that only applies to insiders isn't morality. The good news is, we've already seen what happens when people choose progress over dogma. The arc isn't automatic, and it's never smooth. But it bends, when people push it. Every time someone says, this isn't right, and refuses to stay silent, every time someone listens instead of punishes, every time a law is changed not to reflect scripture, but to reflect conscience, that's the real moral evolution, not handed down from above, but worked out, step by step, by people who choose to care. And maybe that's what makes it valuable, not because it's written in stone, but because we keep writing it together. Let's look at something that doesn't get discussed enough: how moral systems built on divine command affect our thinking. Even when we're trying to be fair, when morality is grounded in religious authority, it becomes external. You follow rules not because they make sense or because they lead to better outcomes, but because they're said to be sacred, and that shapes how people think about right and wrong. Instead of asking, who does this hurt? Or, is this fair? People start asking, is this allowed? That's a different mindset. It turns moral questions into obedience tests. And that has consequences. It makes it harder to change course, even when the harm is obvious. Because now the harm is justified, as long as it follows the rule. That's how you end up with people defending child marriage, or unequal inheritance laws, or corporal punishment, not because they enjoy these things, but because their sacred text says they're acceptable. Once something is treated as morally good because it's commanded, not because it's kind, fair, or helpful, you open the door to almost anything. And once that logic is in place, it can't be challenged without challenging the whole system. Contrast that with secular human rights frameworks. These systems don't claim moral perfection. They're designed to be questioned. They ask, is this policy working? Is this protecting people? Is there a better way? In other words, they're built for error correction. That's what makes them powerful. Not that they're flawless, but that they're fixable. Some will argue that holy books teach love, compassion, and mercy. And yes, there are verses like that. But they're always mixed with verses of violence, control, and exclusion. There's a saying, if a system gives you permission to be good sometimes, and cruel other times, it's not a good system. A truly moral system encourages kindness without exceptions, not kindness toward insiders, and punishment for everyone else. And if we're honest, that's how most religious systems work. There's always an in-group and an out-group. The saved and the damned. The believers and the heretics. Human rights don't make those distinctions. They start with the idea that everyone matters. Not because of who they worship. Not because of their heritage. Just because they're human. That's a radical idea, still, in many parts of the world. And it's why the clash between religious texts and human rights isn't going away. You'll hear people say, well, we can just ignore the harsh parts. But that assumes a level of privilege. In places where holy law is enforced, people don't get to ignore the harsh parts. They live under them, they go to jail for questioning. They lose custody for leaving a religion. They're denied jobs, education, and medical care. In some cases, they die, and these aren't accidents. These are the natural consequences of building systems on books that were never designed to protect human rights in the modern sense, because let's be clear, when those books were written, the idea of universal rights didn't exist. The concept of rights, as we use it today, especially for minorities, women, or children, wasn't part of the worldview. Back then, might made right. Kings and prophets spoke for gods. Tribes fought for survival. Morality was tribal. Loyalty came before empathy, and that worldview made it into the texts. In some places, genocide is commanded. In others, rape victims are told to marry their attackers. None of this was shocking back then. But it should be shocking now, and if we find ourselves defending those passages, or explaining them away, or skipping over them, maybe that tells us something. Maybe it tells us that our moral sense has moved on, and if it has, maybe that's a good thing. There's also a psychological angle worth exploring. Studies in moral psychology show that people are more likely to make ethical decisions when they focus on outcomes and empathy, not rules handed down by authority, in fact, blind. Obedience to authority has been one of the key factors in some of the worst human rights abuses in history. Milgram's famous experiment showed how easily people follow harmful orders when they believe the source is legitimate. When people believe they're following divine commands, the same logic applies, and sometimes with even more intensity, because now, disobedience isn't just risky, it's unthinkable. It's a threat to the soul. A betrayal of the ultimate authority. That's how you get honor killings, moral policing, religious courts punishing thought crimes, all done by people who believe they're doing good. It's not about individual cruelty. It's about a system that replaces moral reflection with religious duty, and when that happens, compassion becomes optional. But it doesn't have to be this way. People can change. Systems can change. Values can evolve, and they already have, in many parts of the world. More countries are moving toward secular law, at least in principle. More people are recognizing that equality isn't a threat to tradition, it's an improvement on it. The more we rely on reason, empathy, and open dialogue, the less we need to appeal to authority. The more we value people for who they are, not what they believe, the closer we get to real justice. Most people would say they support human rights. Most people would also say they respect religious tradition. What they may not realize is that these two things don't always get along. The language of human rights sounds simple. Everyone has dignity. Everyone deserves freedom. No one should be harmed, excluded, or punished for their identity, their beliefs, or their choices. As long as they're not hurting anyone else, that sounds fair. It sounds like common sense. But it isn't the message we get from most religious texts. Holy books were written in a very different world. A world of empires, slavery, arranged marriage, and divine punishment. They reflect the values of those times, not the ones we hold today, and that's not just a matter of tone or outdated customs. It's about real, direct contradictions. Take the concept of equality. The modern idea is that all people are equal, not in how smart or successful they are, but in the rights they're entitled to. The right to life. To speak freely. To believe, or not believe. To love who they love. To be protected by law, regardless of race, gender, or background. Now open almost any holy book, and that's not what you'll find. You'll find laws that treat men and women differently. That place one group above another. That punish people for their sexuality or their thoughts. That allow slavery, child marriage, and violent penalties for things we now call private choices. People who defend these books often say, well, those verses are misunderstood. Or, that was the culture back then. But here's the question, if the text is supposed to be timeless, why does it need constant explanation or updating? Why do we have to bend over backwards to fit it into modern values, instead of expecting it to lead us there on its own? That's not a minor issue. It gets to the heart of something important. Holy books claim moral authority. Human rights depend on moral reasoning. One is supposed to be fixed. The other is supposed to grow, and that growth matters. Because our understanding of fairness, harm, and dignity has changed, through lived experience, social progress, and careful thought. We now see things that once looked acceptable, and realize they were never right to begin with, but when religious law gets in the way, it doesn't bend easily. Because admitting a change is needed means admitting it wasn't perfect to begin with. Let's talk about freedom of belief. You might think that's a basic human right. No one should be forced to believe something. And yet, apostasy, leaving the faith, is still illegal in many religious countries. In some, it's punishable by death. That's not symbolic. That's actual law. In Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Mauritania, openly leaving the religion, or even criticizing it, can mean prison or worse. The justification? Scripture. The Quran has verses interpreted to say that those who leave should be killed. The Hadith, the sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, make it even more explicit. In the Old Testament, the punishment for worshipping other gods is death. In the New Testament, eternal damnation awaits unbelievers. Now compare that with Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, including the freedom to change religion or belief. You can't have both. You can't say people are free to choose, and then threaten them for choosing differently. And here's the thing, human rights didn't come from holy books. They didn't descend from a mountain. They came from people seeing suffering and deciding it didn't have to be that way, after world wars. After genocide. After oppression. We slowly began to recognize that power has to be restrained by principle. That no idea, not even a religious one, should come before a person's right to live and think freely. Still, many countries base their laws on scripture. And when they do, certain people pay the price. Women, for example, are almost always at the losing end. In many interpretations of religious law, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's. In some cases, she can't travel without a male guardian. She might need permission to work. Her clothing is regulated. Her behavior is scrutinized. And her autonomy is never fully her own. This isn't just theory. It's law in places like Afghanistan, where girls are banned from school. In Iran, where women are arrested for not wearing a headscarf. In some Jewish Orthodox communities, where women are denied a religious divorce without the husband's permission. In conservative Christian courts, where victims of abuse are told to stay married because divorce is unbiblical. These aren't distant cultures or ancient practices. This is now. And it's not because people are bad. It's because they're following what they believe is divine will. But here's the problem, divine will is not up for debate. Human rights are. That may sound like a weakness. But it's actually a strength. Because it means we can adapt. We can notice when harm is being done, and change course. We can listen. We can learn. Holy books don't evolve. Their words are fixed. But people do evolve. And that's why we need systems that let us do just that. You often hear, you can interpret the scriptures in a peaceful way. And that's true. But you can also interpret them in violent, exclusionary ways, and that's exactly what extremists do. Which version wins out? Usually, it's the one backed by power. Not the one that's more loving or humane. That's why interpretation alone isn't enough. If the text can justify both peace and cruelty, it's not the text guiding us, it's our moral instincts, and if we already have those instincts, maybe we don't need the text. The truth is, our best moral progress has happened not when we followed Scripture, but when we challenged it, when we stopped accepting what was written and started asking, is this fair? Is this compassionate? Does this protect people? You can trace almost every major human rights advance to people doing exactly that. Abolition of slavery. Women's suffrage. Civil rights. Decriminalization of same-sex relationships. Child protection laws. Access to education. None of these movements were led by religion. In most cases, religious authorities resisted them. Not always out of cruelty, but out of consistency, with texts that were simply out of step with reality. Take slavery. It's directly endorsed in every major Abrahamic scripture. Rules for owning slaves. How to treat them. How to pass them on as inheritance. Not one of these books says, slavery is wrong. You won't find that line anywhere, and yet today, we all agree it's wrong. We don't look back and say, well, maybe it was okay in context. We say, it was never okay. It just took us too long to realize it, so how did we realize it? We didn't get there by rereading ancient texts. We got there by trusting our empathy, and building ethical systems that put people first. Human rights do that. They're not perfect, and they don't always work in practice the way they should. But the principle is clear, no one's pain is sacred. No one's suffering should be excused because it's written down in an old book, and when there's a conflict between what's holy and what's humane, we should choose the humane. Let's talk about LGBTQ+ rights. This might be the clearest example of the clash between modern values and traditional religion. In secular democracies, same-sex couples can marry, adopt, work, serve in government, and live without hiding who they are. It's not about special treatment, it's about equal protection, but in Scripture, homosexuality is described as sinful, in some texts, punishable by death. These verses are still cited in religious schools, sermons, and laws. In Uganda, new legislation imposes harsh penalties for same-sex relationships. In Russia, gay propaganda laws make it illegal to speak positively about LGBTQ+ identities. In parts of the Middle East, gay people are arrested, tortured, or killed. The justification is always the same: our values, our religion. But values that lead to cruelty aren't values worth defending. If your freedom depends on someone else being silenced or erased, maybe it's not freedom at all. This isn't just about governments. It's also about families, communities, and the psychological weight of being told you're wrong simply for being yourself. Studies show that LGBTQ+ teens in deeply religious homes are at higher risk of depression, anxiety, and suicide. Not because they lack faith, but because faith has been turned against them, and again, holy books don't offer a way out. You can reinterpret them, soften them, or ignore certain passages. But they still say what they say. In contrast, human rights frameworks say, you belong. You're not a mistake. You have the same rights as anyone else, no exceptions. It's not just kinder. It's clearer. Now someone might ask, why not just combine the two? Why not read religious texts in a human rights-friendly way? The answer is, that's already happening, to an extent. Many people do interpret their faith in more progressive ways. And that's better than the alternative, but the key difference is this: human rights evolve by design. They're made to be reviewed, debated, tested, and updated. Religion, especially when taken literally, is not, and when religious belief holds power, whether in a theocracy or just in public policy, it tends to resist change. Because change implies fallibility. And fallibility undermines authority. That's why in many religious countries, challenging a law that comes from Scripture is treated not just as dissent, but as blasphemy. A crime not just against the state, but against the sacred, and that's dangerous. Because once you can't question an idea, you can't protect people from what that idea might justify. Human rights are the opposite. They exist to be questioned, by those who suffer, by those who are left out, by those whose dignity is overlooked. That's how they get stronger. There's something else worth noticing too. Holy books often talk about justice in terms of obedience. Justice is doing what God says. Following the law. Staying in your place, but human rights flip that idea. They say justice is about freedom. It's about choice. It's about limiting power, not enforcing it, and that changes everything, because when power is sacred, it can't be wrong. But when people are sacred, power has to answer to them.